Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, April the 16th, 2023. Not a day seems to go by without us doing something on the inequalities and divisions in America. Yesterday, we did a show with the conservative journalist Batya Ungasagan, who believes that American elites, mostly liberal elites as it happens, in her view at least, have betrayed the country's working men and women. She leaves out class in terms of defining the working men and women as the working class, but her book is called Second Class: How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women. One man who's spent his career looking at the travails of the American working class, I don't think he would be uncomfortable using that term, is Dale Maharidge. He's a very distinguished writer, journalist, essayist. He teaches at Columbia Journalism School. He's won all sorts of awards. He was on the show a couple of years ago talking about, at that point at least, his new book, Fucked at Birth, Recalibrating the American Dream for the 2020s. And he has a new book out today. It's called American Doom Loop, Dispatches from a Troubled Nation, the 1980s to the 2020s. Which he revisits a lot of the themes and individuals he's covered over the years. And he's joining us from his office at Columbia University. Dale, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to look at Second Class, but in terms of your analysis of what's happened over the last 40 years, does, in your view, Ungasagan, does she have a point that American elites, perhaps of the left or of the right, conservative or progressive elites, have betrayed America's working men and women?
Yeah, I blame both parties. Of course, I blame Republicans a little bit more for some things, but so many of the policies that are affecting what's going on in America today, the anger, the rage, this discontent, started when I started as a reporter in 1980 with the shutdowns of the industrial heartland. I went to Youngstown, Ohio, and documented the death of the steel industry, 50,000 jobs lost. And that was a decision made by both parties. Basically, we wrote off the middle of the country. It was a corporate takeover. So I have blame on both sides, although Democrats have a little kinder, gentler, but not much so, touch than the Republicans.
You're not the type of person to toot your own horn, but it's worth noting that you're one of the remarkable things about your story is you inspired Bruce Springsteen in terms of your description of the middle of the country. Your work inspired his great song Youngstown. Tell me about that relationship and how you got on Springsteen's radar.
Well, the book came out in 1985. In 1995, I got a call from somebody who worked for Bruce Springsteen who said, Bruce wants to meet you. And when we met, eventually we were in Youngstown together when he played there. He picked the book up 10 years later off his bookshelf. He bought it when it came out. And the song Youngstown chronicles the Marshall family. They worked in the sheet and tube, the U.S. Steel plant in Youngstown. After 37 and a half years, Mr. Marshall, who landed at Normandy D-Day, was one of 4 survivors on his landing craft in 1944. They blew it up, and basically he and his son were out of work. So it was very difficult, but I asked the father and son to give me a tour of the ruins that were all blown up. And as he's walking through the ruins, Mr. Marshall said, what Hitler couldn't do, they did it for him.
Mm.
Well, Bruce uses that in his song, Them Big Boys Did What Hitler Couldn't Do. And if you listen to the full band version of Bruce's song, he encaptures the rage that I documented in the 80s. That song, don't read my first book, just listen to his song. In 240 words or so, he sums up what happened to the working class in America.
Yeah, well, you should read both. You should never discourage people, Dale, from reading your own book. I saw Springsteen actually in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago, and he didn't play any of that stuff, which was rather disappointing. But that's another show, another narrative. Let's get to the book that's out today. Congratulations, America Doom Loop: Dispatches from a Troubled Nation, 1980s to the 2020s. Tell me about this book, the kind of book it is, because it's not just a collection of essays. Much of it is a narrative of people that you met in the 80s who you return to.
Yeah, I like doing a really deep dive work. I don't like just going to somebody, putting their story between the pages, and then moving on. I go back and back and back. And in this book, I went back to victims of violence that I covered when I was in Sacramento, California, on the police beat, large and small. For instance, a real quick story. I covered the very first schoolyard shooting in Stockton, California. A man named Patrick Purdy went into the schoolyard and opened fire and killed kids and wounded a whole bunch of others. And that led Congress to pass a law banning military-style assault rifles and large-capacity feeding devices like 100-shot drums. I grew up deer hunting. I have nothing against hunting or rifles used for hunting, but this was military weapons that were banned. And then in 2004, the law was allowed to expire. And we know what happened since 2004. Every year there are more and more mass shootings with large capacity feeding drums. So that's just one doom loop I covered. Another was homeless in Sacramento. In 1980, when I first got to the paper in late 1980, I was captivated by public inebriates. At the time, they were called winos. We wouldn't call them that now. But these were just poor guys who were on really hard times. And so I documented them, and there were 900 according to officials, and they mostly lived in SRO hotels, those cheap flop house hotels. I walked in the woods along the rivers in Sacramento and found a few pieces of cardboard and newspaper in the bushes. Well, 2 years later, there were suddenly a whole bunch more people in the woods. In my first story, I did not use the word homeless. By 1982, I was using the word homeless, and I just dove into that story, really went deep dive, rode the rails with the new hobos in the early 1980s. 1986, I did a survey. I walked all 10 miles of the riverbanks in Sacramento and found well over 100 camps with tents and such. Well, I went back during the pandemic, and there were 5,000 to 10,000 homeless people in that area. So in a span of those years, we had homeless just went off the charts. Now, I can go into the blame for it. For many years, going back to where we started in this show, I blamed Republicans, conservatives, but I've come to realize good liberals, and I put that in quotes, are equally to blame. For instance, here in New York City, they tried to get affordable housing in Westchester County, north of New York City, which is a wealthy county. They've resisted it for years. Governor Hochul's measure failed dismally. 80% of the voters in Westchester County voted for Biden. They put Black Lives Matter signs in their front lawns, but their message is, we will support you, but just don't live near us. And so these restricted...
Don't fuck with us, perhaps that could be the title of your next book. It's interesting that you're clearly on the left, and Saga and Unga Sagan is clearly on the right, that you seem to agree on much of your critique of liberalism. Let's talk a little bit more about this homelessness crisis. You have an interesting piece, I think it's derived from the book, in the LA Times. What has happened, Dale? We've had this enormous rise in the value of homes. You note this in the op-ed in the Times. Your class, my class, we're all rich because of our real estate. And younger people, whether or not they're well employed or not, they can't afford their own homes. What is this narrative? Why has it happened? And coming back to your point, why are liberals as much to blame? Because they're so much opposed to development?
Well, I've got mine. I'm in my middle class, upper class neighborhood. I don't want affordable housing near me. Well, in California, that means units costing $800,000. We're not talking ghetto housing, but there's been resistance in many communities, East, West Coast, against building more affordable units. I believe that in Los Angeles, we have to go up, not keep going out. Sprawl is not the answer. And there was a bill a few years back that would have allowed for apartment buildings, high-rise apartment buildings in transit corridors. And that failed miserably because people don't want that quote unquote bad housing in their neighborhoods. Well, I live here in New York City. There's a lot of high-rise buildings with wonderful, vibrant neighborhoods around them. But this resistance has limited the housing supply. So the children of these boomer NIMBYs, and I'm a boomer, and I'm kind of tired with my generation, have basically refused to allow affordable housing to be built, or that is, apartment buildings or condo units that are high rise that their children can afford. I had a student in my last year in my class who didn't believe me when I said there was never homelessness does not always have has existed in America. She didn't believe me. She just assumed homelessness had always been with us. Then I realized she's like 22, 23 years old. And I started covering this in 1980. Basically, as twice as long as she's been alive, there's been homeless. So of course she thinks it's a normal situation.
Yeah, I was down in LA last month. I wanted to visit the RFK school now, which had been the location of the Ambassador Hotel where RFK was assassinated in '68. And what astonished me was there was this new school that looked pretty nice. It was surrounded by a huge wall. It could have been a prison or a mental asylum. It was a school. And surrounding it were all these homeless encampments, but they weren't housed, so to speak, by what you would sort of conventionally associate as homeless people, as vagrants. They were housed by young people. Is that increasingly becoming normal, Dale, that young people are living in homeless encampments?
Oh, absolutely. When I started out back in the early 80s, it was mostly men on the road looking for work. We actually looked for women and younger people and didn't really find them. And then you started seeing the change. Whole families. The families, though, have to hide because the social services will take the kids. But you see lots of young people, and it's become it's a doom loop. It's become a cycle. And for the critics who say that, oh, they're just all addicted to drugs, and you hear that, I point in the article I did for the LA Times, in Jackson, Mississippi, which has 1/6 the homeless of Los Angeles, rents are $800 a month. The average rent in LA is $2,800 a month. So if you can't afford the apartment, you end up on the street. And I've been out there reporting enough to know that if I were homeless for a year or two, I'd probably be drinking and using drugs as well. I mean, they're self-medicating.
Yeah, I was just in a couple of months ago, I was in Jackson, and come to think of it, I didn't see a lot of homeless people, or I didn't see a lot of people anyway. San Francisco, along with New York and Los Angeles, is the home, so to speak, of homelessness. We did a show actually late last year, a live show with Kevin Adler at Green Apple Books. Kevin, I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, Dale. He's a homeless advocate, activist. He has a new book out, When We Walk By, Forgotten Humanity, Broken Systems, and the Role We Can Each Play in Ending Homelessness in America. He has a kind of humanistic approach to this, is that we should all befriend homeless people. I'm guessing that for you, that's a little too feel good of a solution. What are your thoughts on Adler's argument? And I don't want to put Kevin in a box. He's a remarkable guy, and what he does is amazing.
Well, we should be nice to these people because they are us.
And that's his point, that any of us could get in. It's kind of like a Rawlsian situation where if we draw one short straw, one unlucky number, then we could end up in that car or that tent.
Absolutely. I've seen it over and over and over. And frankly, in my early years reporting on this, I really lived in terror of becoming homeless. I was young. I didn't have much equity. I did buy a house when I was young. I was able to because I could afford it, unlike today. But when I came back from that reporting trip, the one that inspired Bruce Springsteen, I had $5 in the bank, in thousands of dollars on my credit card, and one layoff. Something could have happened to me at that point. It would have tripped me up. Um, I'm fortunate, but I'm also very lucky. I don't count on anything. I got an email after the LA Times piece from a man who had a house in Malibu who has some medical condition that wasn't covered. This is many years ago, and he had a downward spiral, and now he's homeless. So it can.
And what's interesting, sorry to jump in here, in your Times piece and in the book, is if you can get even on the bottom rung, then you're pretty secure. You note that you bought your home for a relatively small amount of money, and now you're part of this privileged class. It's not because you've done anything wrong. You just happened to get on the chopper before Saigon fell.
That's a good way to put it, Andrew. I tell my students, it's like I ran across a bridge that's blowing up and burning behind me. The young people are on the other side. I got across, but they're not going to get across. And that's not the America I want to live in.
But do you have kids, Dale?
I do not. I did not go down.
Well, but at some point, even the great Dale Maharidge will die, and your wealth will be redistributed. I've got kids. My kids may not be able to afford homes of their own, but when I pass on, they'll get mine. Won't it just be a generational thing that the baby boomers will eventually die out? I think most people will be reasonably pleased with that, even baby boomers. And then the wealth will just, so to speak, in Reagan terms, get redistributed, trickle down home equity.
Yes, it's becoming like the United Kingdom, where inherited wealth. I have friends who have children, and they're passing their houses on to them. Especially in California, that's the only way they're going to be able to get a house. So it just further entrenches the two-class society. Homeownership, as you know, is a vehicle for becoming part of the system, for caring, for having equity in yourself and in the country. This is why I advocate we have to change our zoning and allow affordable houses that the children of the boomers and the children of Xers, I mean, the Xers are getting older too, can afford, and not those who can't inherit it will end up just poorer than we are now.
We're speaking with Dale Maharidge. Many of you will be familiar with his remarkable journalistic career. Also inspired Bruce Springsteen, which is quite an achievement in itself. He has a new collection out, American Doom Loop. Very important collection, which he's focusing, as he's done over the last 40 years, on the inequalities, inequities, injustices of America. American Doom Loop, Dispatches from a Troubled Nation, 1980s to the 2020s. I want to remind everyone that great guests like Dale are brought to us because of our friends at Liberties, the quarterly journal of culture and politics. Going to run a short feature on Liberties. And then we'll be back with Dale to address what can be done to address all the inequities of the America of the 2020s. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back with Dale Maharidge in a couple of seconds.
News, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Dale Maharidge, the author of a new collection, American Doom Loop. Dale, before the break, we were talking about the housing crisis. Last week, we had a couple of housing experts on. They have a new book out, Housing the Nation, Social Equity, Architecture, and the Future of Affordable Housing. It's edited by Alexander Gorlin, who runs the Gorlin Architecture Company in New York, and Victoria Newhouse, a very powerful woman in New York. They talk about rebuilding, not just New York, but America. Is that the solution, just more housing?
Well, it's a help, but my reading list is going to increase after this show. It's part of the solution. There's other elements. We have to have well-paying jobs, of course, so you can afford to pay for those apartments. But apartment rents have gone way high. It's become way beyond out of the reach of people who work at fast food places and other low-wage jobs. So. I'm not an absolutist about it, but I know this for sure. The answer is not building little shacks and such. There's so many stories of they'll spend millions and millions and millions of dollars to build a little village of basically tool sheds that cost $250,000 each. I'd rather see that money go into real housing where people can really live and have dignity.
There was, of course, the great rebuilding at Levittown after the Second World War, an attempt very flawed, certainly given its racist elements, to house Americans, middle-class Americans, lower middle-class Americans, to enable the American dream. Do we need new Levittowns, Dale?
I'm not sure. Levittowns were sprawl, and as you noted, they were very racially segregated.
Well, blacks were essentially not allowed access to Levittown. So white. It was a white-only zone. It was rather apartheid-like.
There were covenants written into the contracts that you would not sell to somebody who wasn't white. That's crazy. No, I think we have to become more like Japan or New York City, where we go up. We just can't keep going out. We have to change how we live. And again, that doesn't mean building slum housing. If we have high-rise corridors like we have in New York City, the Upper West Side and Upper East Side are I don't know how many tens of thousands of people are per square mile. It's humongous. And we have vibrant neighborhoods. It's a different way of living. It isn't the lawn that you mow and the picket fence. Although a lot of these new developments, there's not even any lawn. The houses are so close to each other. It has to be a mix of housing. All I know is that the present policies, and it really ties into zoning, are not working because we're here. I am not a housing expert. It just seems logical, though, that if you create more housing, prices will become more affordable. When you have a rare commodity, the prices just keep going up.
Is it realistic, though, for the middle of the country, the center of the country, which you argue we Americans wrote off in the 1980s, to start trying to build high-rises in the middle of Milwaukee or Cleveland or Akron?
The problem is, if you go to Cleveland or Detroit, where I've been, east side of Cleveland or much of Detroit, there's empty housing, abandonment. As far as you can drive in Detroit for 40 minutes and just pass up ruins and abandonment. I documented people who were just taking over houses and squatting in them and making them nice a few years back. So the problem there is a whole different story. Jobs are needed there. So the housing is not a universal American issue. Right now, if you go to Detroit, you can homestead. I think the city will give you the house if you pay the taxes, some minor amount. You can homestead a house that's been abandoned. So it's not structures that are needed there, it's jobs.
Dale, we were promised that it wouldn't matter where we lived with the digital revolution. Anyone could live anywhere. You can work from anywhere, the local Starbucks. Everyone has Wi-Fi. What's happened? Why? It's odd. On the one hand, places like New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles are increasingly unaffordable, which accounts for the terrible homelessness. On the other hand, everyone still wants to live in these elite coastal places. Why?
Well, I guess that's human nature. The thing you mentioned, though, we all work online. I remember a study that came out during the pandemic. Only 9% of Americans could work from home. The rest of the Americans have to drive the trucks, have to pick the fruit, have to, deliver the materials, and so forth. So it's only a fraction of us who can work online and live remote. Again, the truck driver can't do that remotely, although they're trying to take that truck driver's job by making trucks self-driving, but that's another story.
Dale, where's the innovation going to come from? The Nostalgists believe that there'll be a Marshall Plan for housing, which isn't going to come. The American government's weaker and weaker, more and more dysfunctional, doesn't attract smart people, doesn't pay properly, and gets quite literally raped by politicians like Trump. Where's the innovation going to come from?
Wow, I think it's going to have to be the states. It's not going to be the federal government. When I started doing this work 40 years ago, I thought I was naive enough to think that I'll put this work out there. It'll be like the 1930s. The federal government will come in with some, plan, the New Deal, a New Deal. I was naive enough to think that was going to happen. That is not going to happen. It's going to be states. I know the Governor Hochul tried that measure a year ago to change zoning and force, affordable housing, which is again not cheap housing in community, and it failed. But we're getting incremental change. There were 60 bills passed in the California legislature last year dealing with housing. Some of them very good. Speeding up environmental reviews, for instance. A lot of NIMBYs were using environmental laws to block the most specious of ways to block a condo from being built down the street. So things like that are incrementally helping, but we do need a Marshall Plan. Unfortunately, it's not going to come from Washington.
Not everyone on the left, I think Dale would agree. Last week, we also had Natalie Foster, a Bay Area-based political activist. She believes that there is a New Deal. She believes that the arc of the 21st century American moral universe is bending towards justice. She said that the COVID years proved that. The American government spent tens of billions of dollars fighting successfully the virus. How would you respond to people like Foster, who suggest that the architecture of this New Deal already exists?
Well, the architecture exists, but are any bills going to pass in this Congress the way it's going? And no matter what happens in November, it's going to be very contentious. The Republicans have become a party of just saying no. They're not going to vote for a bill that's going to create another New Deal. I wish I could be as hopeful as that author. I don't want to be pessimistic. I want to have hope. It's going to be, but I think it's going to be a lot of fighting is needed between now and the time that we actually do something.
Dale, I'm guessing that you're no great friend of Donald Trump or the MAGA movement, but you're equally critical of liberals. You said good liberals, and I'm using your language here, equally to blame. For ourselves, for our audience, what can good liberals do to start rethinking America, given that they have equal, at least in your argument, equal blame for the situation in 2024?
Look in the mirror. You put your Black Lives Matter sign in the front lawn, and then you go to a council meeting and oppose the apartment building, a mile from your house. I know some people in Sacramento were opposing some apartment buildings that were 2 and 3 miles from their houses, saying that the quality of life was going to change. And they use euphemisms like traffic. They don't want more traffic. And what they're really saying is that we don't want people of color nearby. So people are going to have to assess within what are we doing really here. And I think there's a growing sense of this happening in my friends. I mean, I haven't gone down random streets and talked to NIMBYs in these neighborhoods just doing a poll, but I get a sense there's more awareness. But we have to change ourselves if we're going to change society. And if you're going to call yourself a good liberal, think about what that means, how you live your life. If you're going to oppose that apartment building a mile from your house, what's really going on inside your head?
Dale, you teach at Columbia Journalism School, so you're very familiar with young writers, young journalists. We talked earlier about the generational quality of the real estate crisis, of not being able to afford one's own home. Do you see much manifestation of a generational political shift? Where people are rethinking everything, not just real estate, but economics, tax, even capitalism itself?
Absolutely. I've been teaching now for 32 years, and I would say the trend is way more socialist. Socialism is not a bad term among my students. Of course, I have some European students here, and my American students are very much in agreement with them on many things. And so the climate is changing. And again, I'm seeing a select group of kids, but also the middle of the country has changed. I mean, just going around, when I started reporting back in the 80s, gay marriage was vilified in a lot of places, and it's been normalized. I mean, I've been in very conservative places and been in groups where there are gay people and straight people, and we've talked about this, and there's much more acceptance of these sorts of things that were not accepted 40 years ago. So there has been a generational shift for the better, I think.
Yeah, Sasha Isikoff, who's been on the show, he wrote the book The Engagement about the remarkable shift in the country's mood over gay marriage, from deep hostility to unthinking acceptance. Where's the story then in America, Dale? Someone wandered into your office and said, I want to write a book about hope in America, promise in America. You've been reporting rather darkly in some ways on America, and this is covered in your new book, American Doom Loop, Dispatches from a Troubled Nation, 1980s to the 2020s. If they're to escape the doom loop and write about the 2020s and the 2030s, where's the story? Where would you send people to look, to report, to talk to?
Oh, there's all sorts of good things going on, and I've written about some of them. I mean, in Cleveland, there's the Evergreen Corporation. It's a socialist business model based on the Mogollon Corporation in Spain, where these companies are being created that are worker owned. They have a laundry in Cleveland where they're employing several hundred people, paying them very good wages, and the workers own the company. Up in New England, there's Coastal Enterprises Incorporated. It's a B corporation model where it's a hybrid of capitalism and socialism. I interviewed a water woman. She was a fisherwoman, and the fisheries tanked, and she was the first kelp farmer they were funding. She was raising kelp, and it's used in many products in America. It's not just what you eat in a Japanese restaurant. It's in toothpaste, etc. She was going to have a whole new living on this sustainable way of farming the ocean. So there's these job models that are happening around that are just amazing. And again, I find hope in youth. The number one issue among young people is climate change. It's taken over everything, and I think they realize that if the earth isn't hospitable for us, every other issue doesn't really matter. And so I would focus on the young. I would focus on some of these places that are doing innovation. And there are places doing housing innovation as well in Texas. So there's plenty of good stories out there to write about.